My family took me to a water park. Now, I like to swim. Swimming is my exercise. I frolic. But there are rides at the park. Horrible nay-nay rides. The first ride we went on was the giant slide. It's like 20 stories high. And I'm looking for the elevator. There's no elevator. How do you get up there? It's $35 to get in. You should carry my ass up there. How do you get up? I'm in flip-flops and a Speedo, and I'm walking up a mountain. Let's not visualize, just let's move on, shall we?
Good morning. It's Thursday, Delta Force Thursday, December the 7th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we will have Military Shorts, Bishop Barron, Duty, Honor, Country, 33 Strategies of War, and the latest from inside Delta Force. All that and more when I come back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I shouldn't change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. Thank you. And now, the military shorts.
And the strange thing about a firefight, during the time you're in the firefight, you're really not that nervous. You got a job to do, you do it the best you can. It's when it's over, all the shooting's stopped, and your mind starts doing tricks with you. Are they circling around us? It could have been, that bullet could have been 3 inches over and you then dead, or at least shot in the arm or something. It's usually after the firefight is when it really comes down, and that'll last for several days. But usually during the time of the firefight, it's just so much going on, and you're so focused, you're really not that nervous. It's kind of a strange phenomenon.
Essex-class aircraft carriers represented a significant part of the United States fleet during and after World War II. This class of aircraft carrier was designed to provide an enhanced capability to transport and operationally utilize carrier-based aircraft. With a total length of almost 270 meters and a width of over 45 meters, the Essex class are among the largest aircraft carriers of their time. The first ships of this class were launched in 1940, and they gradually became key players in the Pacific battles of the Second World War. A significant characteristic of the Essex class was their ability to carry more than 90 aircraft on board, including fighter, bomber, and torpedo machines. Their armament and operational scale allowed them to play a key role in the fight against Japanese forces in the Pacific Ocean. After the war, many of the Essex-class ships took part in operational missions around the world and were often upgraded to meet changing needs. Some of them also served during the Cold War and participated in the conflicts in Korea and Vietnam. During their long service, they underwent several modernization programs to maintain their effectiveness in the rapidly changing wartime environment. The Essex class remains a symbol of formidable U.S. naval power in the post-World War II era and provides an important insight into the development and capabilities of aircraft carriers throughout the 20th century.
It is designed to engage a wide range of targets, including aircraft, ballistic and cruise missiles, and even certain types of hypersonic missiles. The S-400 system has a maximum engagement range of up to 250 miles for certain missile types, although the effective range may vary depending on factors like target altitude and speed. It can simultaneously engage and track multiple targets up to 80 targets simultaneously, with engagement priorities determined by the operator. The S-400 system employs different types of missiles, including long-range and medium-range interceptors. The system typically employs the 40N6 missile for long-range engagements, capable of engaging targets at extended distances, while the 48N6 and 9M96 missiles are used for medium-range engagements. The S-400 system utilizes phased array radars, including the 91N6E early warning radar, the 92N6E engagement radar, and the 96L6E acquisition radar.
In the Middle Ages, Jews were hated because of their religion. In the 19th century and the 20th, they were hated because of their race. Today, when it's no longer done to hate people for their religion or their race, today they are hated because of their state. The reason changes, but the hate stays the same. Anti-Zionism is the new anti-Semitism. Because make no mistake, this will be the defining battle of the 21st century. Which will prevail? The will to power with its violence, terror, missiles and bombs, or the will to life with its hospitals, schools, freedoms and rights? Every time I visit Israel, I find among Israelis, secular or religious, an absolute unswerving dedication to Moshe Rabbeinu's great command, choose life, because we have to stand up and fight, and we have to stand up and win.
It was Christmas Eve, 1944, and Army Chaplain Sam Neill of the 106th Infantry Division would spend it as a prisoner of war, cramped in a boxcar near the railroad yards at Limburg, Germany, with 200 hungry and scared young GIs. His unit had been overrun the previous week near Schönberg and forced to surrender. They were packed so tightly they had to stand for days on end, subsisting only on water and a teaspoon of molasses. Neil led the men in prayers and sang Silent Night. A knock followed on the boxcar. "You sing again," said a German guard in halting English, his eyes watering. They sang again. The guard returned with more food. They sang again. More food. It went on for hours. He disobeyed orders and saved us that night, Sam Neill would recall years later. Dr. Sam Neill would go on to found a community college in Florida and live to be 89.
What happens to an aircraft carrier that nobody wants? From 1963 to 2000, the Foch participated in everything from nuclear tests to peacekeeping missions to test flights for the Dassault Rafale. But in 2000, it was sold to Brazil, where after being renamed the Sao Paulo, it languished. An explosion in 2004 killed 3 sailors and led to years of repairs that totaled $19 million. Then, just as the carrier was getting ready to return to sea, fires broke out on board, which required still more repairs. In 2018, Brazil finally sold the Sao Paulo to a Turkish scrapping company, but the ship was turned away due to the high level of hazardous materials contained in the hull. It was towed back across the Atlantic, but Brazil no longer wanted it either. That's why, despite international backlash, the Brazilian Navy scuttled the Sao Paulo in February 2023. The hull contained tons of asbestos, which now may be leaking into the environment and killing marine food chains.
Though the prosecution continued to insist on his guilt, there was no DNA, no firearm, and no forensic evidence presented linking Viegas to the shooting.
If the defendant will please stand.
Within moments, he'll find out if he goes home with his family or spends the rest of his life in prison.
In the District Court of El Paso County, Texas, 409th Judicial District, the State of Texas versus Daniel Viegas, number 94-0D09328. Verdict Form B. We, the jury, find the defendant, Daniel Viegas, not guilty of...
Was too slow to understand. I'll say it real slow in small words. Israel abandoned the Gaza Strip in 2005. It is now 2023. Hamas has ruled the Gaza Strip since 2006. It is now 2023. Hamas is in control of the Gaza Strip. Hamas is holding hostages. Hamas is in control of its own civilians. Those civilians live under the rule of the Hamas government in the Gaza Strip. Those civilians are Hamas's responsibility. It is a war crime to put your civilian in front of military targets. It is a war crime to shield your rockets with children. It is a war crime to hold hostages. It is a war crime to put hostages in a war zone to try to prevent bombing. All of these are war crimes. Every ounce of blood that is spilled, every building that is taken down, every ugly photo you see from Gaza is on Hamas. It is that simple. There is no duality about this.
As a 160th pilot, I did 16 combat deployments. At that time, we were doing about 60 on, 60 off. When you were home for those 60 days, you weren't home, but you were at Fort Benning, Georgia, training with the Rangers, or you were at Dam Neck training with the SEALs. After a number of years, it becomes your life, becomes your routine, and you forget that there's anything else out there. Gone 7 or 8 months out of every year is gone 7 or 8 months. It doesn't matter if you're in a hotel in Virginia Beach or in a B hut in Afghanistan or Iraq. So the payoff is when you go overseas. That's like the big reward. Because generally, every single night that you fly, you're facilitating the nation's most skilled assaulters to make someone bad go away. Every single night you go out, it means something. You're going after the top-tier criminals that are having an effect on global security. The deployments are very meaningful. They're hard because it's an arduous op-tempo. When we're deployed, we fly almost every single night, 7 days a week. There's no days off. The only days off we have is when the weather's too bad to fly. That's why our deployments are limited to anywhere from 30 to 60 to 90 days based on the need. That's about as long as you can handle without hitting chronic fatigue and all those other bad things that go with going out and doing assaults every single night.
What does this small Spanish town have to do with the Cold War? Quite a lot. Because on January 17th, 1966, it became the victim of one of the worst nuclear accidents in history. A B-52 bomber on its way back from a nuclear patrol was carrying 4 nuclear bombs when it collided with a tanker during an air-to-air refueling over a stretch of Spanish coastline. Everything had seemed routine until the B-52 inexplicably approached the tanker too fast, causing an explosion that ripped through both aircraft, killing 7 of the 11 crew members. As 4 men fell from the sky in parachutes, 4 nuclear bombs fell along with them, each one 70 times more powerful than the bombs dropped on Japan at the end of World War II. 2 of the bombs landed intact, but the other 2 exploded on impact. While built-in safety mechanisms prevented a nuclear detonation, the impact caused dangerous levels of plutonium to spread throughout the area of Palomares, creating an environmental disaster.
And that was the military shorts. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Bishop Robert Barron.
What do we see when we see Jesus nailed to the cross? We see our own sin. I know. We're tempted, because our culture teaches us this all the time. We're tempted to say, hey, I'm basically okay. You're basically okay. Don't let anyone tell you got any problems. We're all basically fine. What do we see on that cross, therefore? We see all the forms of human resistance to Christ. Yes, cruelty, hatred, violence, stupidity, injustice. Our own self-absorption, self-protection, running away, denying, betraying. All of that is made visible on the cross. Whenever we're tempted to say, I'm okay and you're okay, all we need to do is hold up the cross of Jesus and we see our own sin. We see as though in a spiritual mirror what is off with us. And see, friends, that is in itself healing.
And that was Bishop Robert Barron. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Chapter 2, Do Not Fight the Last War, from the 33 Strategies of War.
Chapter 2. Do not fight the last war. The guerrilla war of the mind strategy. What most often weighs you down and brings you misery is the past, in the form of unnecessary attachments, repetitions of tired formulas, and the memory of old victories and defeats. You must consciously wage war against the past and force yourself to react to the present moment. Be ruthless on yourself. Do not repeat the same tired methods. Sometimes you must force yourself to strike out in new directions, even if they involve risk. What you may lose in comfort and security, you will gain in surprise, making it harder for your enemies to tell what you will do. Wage guerrilla war on your mind, allowing no static lines of defense, no exposed citadels. Make everything fluid and mobile. The last war. No one has risen to power faster than Napoleon Bonaparte, 1769 to 1821. In 1793, he went from captain in the French Revolutionary Army to brigadier general. In 1796, he became the leader of the French force in Italy fighting the Austrians, whom he crushed that year and again 3 years later. He became first consul of France in 1801, emperor in 1804. In 1805, he humiliated the Austrian and Russian armies at the Battle of Austerlitz. For many, Napoleon was more than a great general. He was a genius, a god of war. Not everyone was impressed, though. There were Prussian generals who thought he had merely been lucky. Where Napoleon was rash and aggressive, they believed, his opponents had been timid and weak. If he ever faced the Prussians, he would be revealed as a great fake. Among these Prussian generals was Friedrich Ludwig, Prince of Hohenlohe-Ingelfingen, 1746 to 1818. Hohenlohe came from one of Germany's oldest aristocratic families, one with an illustrious military record. He had begun his career young, serving under Frederick the Great, 1712 to 86, himself the man who had single-handedly made Prussia a great power. Hohenlohe had risen through the ranks, becoming a general at 50, young by Prussian standards. To Hohenlohe, success in war depended on organization, discipline, and the use of superior strategies developed by trained military minds. The Prussians exemplified all of these virtues. Prussian soldiers drilled relentlessly until they could perform elaborate maneuvers as precisely as a machine. Prussian generals intensely studied the victories of Frederick the Great. War for them was a mathematical affair, the application of timeless principles. To the generals, Napoleon was a Corsican hothead leading an unruly citizens' army. Superior in knowledge and skill, they would out-strategize him. The French would panic and crumble in the face of the disciplined Prussians. The Napoleonic myth would lie in ruins, and Europe could return to its old ways. In August 1806, Hohenlohe and his fellow generals finally got what they wanted. King Friedrich Wilhelm III of Prussia, tired of Napoleon's broken promises, decided to declare war on him in 6 weeks. In the meantime, he asked his generals to come up with a plan to crush the French. Hohenlohe was ecstatic. This campaign would be the climax of his career. He had been thinking for years about how to beat Napoleon, and he presented his plan at the generals' first strategy session. Precise marches would place the army at the perfect angle from which to attack the French as they advanced through southern Prussia. An attack in oblique formation, Frederick the Great's favorite tactic, would deliver a devastating blow. The other generals, all in their 60s and 70s, presented their own plans, but these too were merely variants on the tactics of Frederick the Great. Discussion turned into argument. Several weeks went by. Finally, the king had to step in and create a compromise strategy that would satisfy all of his generals. A feeling of exuberance swept the country, which would soon relive the glory years of Frederick the Great. The generals realized that Napoleon knew about their plans. He had excellent spies. But the Prussians had a head start, and once their war machine started to move, nothing could stop it. On October 5th, a few days before the king was to declare war, disturbing news reached the generals. A reconnaissance mission revealed that divisions of Napoleon's army, which they had believed was dispersed, had marched east, merged, and was massing deep in southern Prussia. The captain who had led the scouting mission reported that the French soldiers were marching with packs on their backs. Where the Prussians used slow-moving wagons to provision their troops, the French carried their own supplies and moved with astonishing speed and mobility. Before the generals had time to adjust their plans, Napoleon's army suddenly wheeled north, heading straight for Berlin, the heart of Prussia. The generals argued and dithered, moving their troops here and there, trying to decide where to attack. A mood of panic set in. Finally, the king ordered a retreat. The troops would reassemble to the north and attack Napoleon's flank as he advanced toward Berlin. Hohenlohe was in charge of the rear guard, protecting the Prussians' retreat. On October 14th, near the town of Jena, Napoleon caught up with Hohenlohe, who finally faced the battle he had wanted so desperately. The numbers on both sides were equal, but while the French were an unruly force, fighting pell-mell and on the run, Hohenlohe kept his troops in tight order, orchestrating them like a corps de ballet. The fighting went back and forth, until finally the French captured the village of Vierzehnheiligen. Hohenlohe ordered his troops to retake the village. In a ritual dating back to Frederick the Great, a drum major beat out a cadence, and the Prussian soldiers, their colors flying, reformed their positions in perfect parade order, preparing to advance. They were in an open plain, though, and Napoleon's men were behind garden walls and on the house roofs. The Prussians fell like 9 pins to the French marksmen. Confused, Hohenlohe ordered his soldiers to halt and change formation. The drums beat again. The Prussians marched with magnificent precision, always a sight to behold. But the French kept shooting, decimating the Prussian line. Never had Hohenlohe seen such an army. The French soldiers were like demons. Unlike his disciplined soldiers, they moved on their own. Yet there was method to their madness. Suddenly, as if from nowhere, they rushed forward on both sides, threatening to surround the Prussians. The prince ordered a retreat. The Battle of Jena was over. Like a house of cards, the Prussians quickly crumbled, one fortress falling after another. The king fled east. In a matter of days, virtually nothing remained of the once mighty Prussian army. interpretation. The reality facing the Prussians in 1806 was simple. They had fallen 50 years behind the times. Their generals were old, and instead of responding to present circumstances, they were repeating formulas that had worked in the past. Their army moved slowly, and their soldiers were automatons on parade. The Prussian generals had many signs to warn them of disaster. Their army had not performed well in its recent engagements. A number of Prussian officers had preached reform, and last but not least, they had had 10 years to study Napoleon, his innovative strategies, and the speed and fluidity with which his armies converged on the enemy. Reality was staring them in the face, yet they chose to ignore it. Indeed, they told themselves that Napoleon was the one who was doomed. You might find the Prussian army just an interesting historical example, but in fact, you are likely marching in the same direction yourself. What limits individuals as well as nations is the inability to confront reality, to see things for what they are. As we grow older, we become more rooted in the past. Habit takes over. Something that has worked for us before becomes a doctrine, a shell to protect us from reality. Repetition replaces creativity. We rarely realize we're doing this because it is almost impossible for us to see it happening in our own minds. Then, suddenly, a young Napoleon crosses our path, a person who does not respect tradition, who fights in a new way. Only then do we see that our ways of thinking and responding have fallen behind the times.
And that was the first part of Chapter 2, Do Not Fight the Last War, from the 33 Strategies of War by Robert Greene. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, a speech by General Douglas MacArthur called Duty, Honor, Country.
They build your basic character. They mold you for your future roles as the custodians of the nation's defense. They make you strong enough to know when you are weak and brave enough to face yourself when you are afraid. They teach you to be proud and unbending in honest failure, but humble and gentle in success. Not to substitute words for actions, not to seek the path of comfort, but to face the stress and spur of difficulty and challenge. To learn to stand up in the storm, but to have compassion on those who fall. To master yourself before you seek to master others. To have a heart that is clean, a goal that is high. To learn to laugh, but yet never forget how to weep. To reach into the future, yet never neglect the past. To be serious, yet never to take yourself too seriously. To be modest, so that you will remember the simplicity of true greatness, the open mind of true wisdom, the meekness of true strength. And what sort of soldiers are those you are to lead. Are they reliable? Are they brave? Are they capable of victory? Their story is known to all of you. It is the story of the American man-at-arms. My estimate of him was formed on the battlefield many, many years ago and has never changed. I regarded him then as I regard him now, as one of the world's noblest figures, not only as one of the finest military characters, but also as one of the most stainless.
Hey, Ben Stiller here.
One of the most stainless. His name and fame are the birthright of every American citizen. In his youth and strength, his love and loyalty, he gave all that mortality can give. Always for them, duty, honor, country. Always their blood and sweat and tears as we sought the way and the light and the truth. You now face a new world, a world of change. The thrust into outer space of the satellite spheres and missiles mark the beginning of another epoch in the long story of mankind. In the 5 or more billions of years the scientists tell us it has taken to form the Earth, in the 3 or more billion years of development of the human race, there has never been a more abrupt or staggering evolution. We deal now not with things of this world alone, but with the illimitable distances and as yet unfathomed mysteries of the universe. We are reaching out for a new and boundless frontier. And through all this welter of change and development, your mission remains fixed, determined, inviolable. It is to win our war. Yours is the profession of arms, the will to win, the sure knowledge that in war there is no substitute for victory, that if you lose, the nation will be destroyed, that the very obsession of your public service must be duty, honor, country. You are the lever which binds together the entire fabric of our national system of defense. From your ranks come the great captains who hold the nation's destiny in their hands the moment the war tocsin sounds. The long, gray line has never failed us. Were you to do so, 1,000,000 ghosts in olive drab, in brown khaki, in blue and gray would rise from their white crosses, thundering those magic words: duty, honor, country.
And that was General Douglas MacArthur with his speech, Duty, Honor, Country. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now we'll pick up where we left off last week with Inside Delta Force.
I would find him in the visitors' parking lot just as the facility closed for the day. The contact would be someone I knew. I cruised through the lot just as a stream of cars and buses was pulling out. I didn't see anyone familiar. But just as I had almost completed a circuit of the parking area, I saw a tall figure with a shock of long red hair dart from behind a small outbuilding into an edge of the parking lot where he was screened by a hedge of boxwoods. It was John Yancey, and his timing was perfect. His path intercepted the edge of the pavement just as I rolled up. I stopped the van for a split second while John jumped in, and then we were on the move and headed for the exit. It was a smooth and natural-looking pickup that would have been difficult to observe. I had felt neither interest in our passage nor a tail, either going in or coming out, but that meant little. So on the way back to town, we made a few shakes and scratches, just to see if any fleas fell off. One of the best ways to do that is to cruise into a cul-de-sac in a residential neighborhood and see who follows you in. If it's a tail, they're burned. This means that you know what they look like, along with the car they're using, so they have to be pulled from the surveillance team, all of which makes life just a little more difficult for the trackers and may cause them to make other mistakes. But we were clean. John and I had first met during selection and hit it off. He was a tall, muscular Texan with a long, loping stride, a narrow, fox-like face, and a sly sense of humor masking granite toughness. He had been a renowned recon man with special forces in Vietnam and was considered one of the best men to be beside during a fight. He was absolutely unflappable, no matter how bad things got. He came to selection from the Special Forces Battalion in Panama, but had badly twisted an ankle during the 18-miler at the start of selection and had to drop out of the course. Rather than go back to Panama, he stayed at Aberdeen camp while his ankle healed and attended the selection course that started as mine was finishing. The ankle continued to be a problem for him throughout selection, and he told me the best thing about the 40-miler was that when his legs finally went numb on him, he couldn't feel the pain of that ankle. John was another of our comrades who would leave us too early. He was shot and killed just a few years later, only 2 weeks before he was to leave the unit for a safer assignment. We compared notes as we rode along. John, too, had been servicing dead drops, casing various sites, and writing reports. In fact, he had unloaded a drop at Mount Vernon, directing us to a pickup in Georgetown that evening. But first, we retrieved John's gear from the flop house where he had stashed it, and then we cruised Georgetown to ready ourselves for the pickup. We plucked Pete Vandervoort from a bus stop just as he walked up and set his bags down by the bench. He was in such a hurry to get in the van that John had to remind him that it would probably be a good idea to bring his bags along for the ride. Pete agreed and jumped back out to grab his bags and give them a toss into the back of the van. If ever a human being was the spirit and image of a Viking, Pete was that man. 6 feet 4 inches tall, wide shoulders, long muscled arms and legs, a thick chest and a small waist. White blonde hair, a long drooping mustache, a craggy brow overhanging deep-set glacier blue eyes fixed in a face that had been forged from steel. At rest, his visage was as fierce as a bird of prey, Animated, his face would set in a clenched jaw, tight-lipped grin. Pete carried his shoulders bunched up a bit, which made his arms hang perfectly straight by his side. He had a peculiar way of walking on the balls of his feet and his toes, never on his heels, and this, combined with the set of his shoulders, made him always look like he was ready to throw or take a punch. Pete was a very powerful man, but he was also a big kid, something I suspect the Viking warriors were as well. Big, rowdy, fun-loving, deadly kids. Pete was carrying information that pertained to all three of us. We would form a cell tasked with performing several collective tasks. He gave us the highlights and caught us up on his recent activities as we drove out of the city to a motel John and I had already earmarked for our base of operations. We needed a more normal place to hole up. 3 men living out of a van were sure to attract attention we didn't want and couldn't afford. We took 2 adjoining rooms at the motel and settled in to study the papers Pete had retrieved from the dead drop he had serviced just before we picked him up. We were charged with several missions, complicated missions, with the potential for hazard and compromise. We were directed to get a roster of the cleaning personnel at the Naval Observatory, a list of the number and types of weapons at a specific National Guard armory, and a copy of next month's operations schedule from Andrews Air Force Base. We had 2 days to accomplish the assignments and prepare a detailed after-action report. The material, the reports, and 2 passport photos of each of us were to be turned over to a contact at a personal meeting. We would get the details of that meeting from a dead drop. The instructions for servicing the drop were on the last page of the instructions. All well and good, but first we needed some nourishment and a plan. Pete folded up the sheets of onion skin and shoved them down the front of his pants. Unless he was strip-searched, they were undetectable and perfectly safe. Then we set out in search of a Korean restaurant. For some inexplicable reason, all 3 of us had a yen for kimchi that evening. Over dinner, we talked man talk. Sports, fishing, hunting, women, politics, anything other than what we were actually doing. By now, the custom of watching what you said and where you said it had become such a habit with us that the only time we discussed business in an open setting was in the sanctuary of the ranch. Back at the motel, we determined a course of action. We would have to divide and conquer. Time was short, the tasks were tricky, and cover for action was going to be critical with a capital C. If even 2 of us showed ourselves at any one place, it would only cause problems. We decided to draw lots for the missions. John drew the Naval Observatory, Pete got the National Guard Armory, and I received Andrews Air Force Base. We were each going to need wheels. I figured that my van had reached the end of its useful life. If it wasn't burned yet, it would be soon, so it was time to turn it back in. John scouted the yellow pages for several rent-a-wreck places and a passport photo shop, while Pete and I kicked around covers for status and action. The next morning, I dropped the guys off at 2 different lots to pick up cars, and I drove back to turn in my van. It deserved a good rest. It had been a good vehicle, and had given me yeoman service. Pete picked me up on the street 2 blocks away and took me to a lot where I rented a Ford Maverick. It was the best vehicle they had on the lot, which should tell you a lot about the place. Still, the little car was a V8 with plenty of power left, and she was relatively nondescript. Before setting off on our individual tasks, we rendezvoused in a grocery parking lot and piled in one car to a little photography shop to have the passport photos taken. We were making small talk as the photographer's assistant trimmed the pictures and placed them in paper holders when, completely out of the blue, Pete launched into a world-class weird conversation. He spun the shop owner a yarn about how the 3 of us were heading to Amsterdam to visit a particular fountain where beautiful, buxom young women gathered every day to frolic topless in the splashing waters of the fountain, all the while encouraging passing tourists to take their pictures. Mysteriously, inexplicably, only the most attractive women were drawn to the fountain, never the old, never the homely, and never the flat-chested. Pete's eyes had a wild, satiric gleam as he told his tale. He leaned into the man's face, holding him with thumb and forefinger by the point of his lapel, all the while extolling the wonders of this miraculous Dutch fountain. He delivered his travelogue with all the snickering glee of a young boy whispering his first dirty joke to his best buddy. The poor shop owner was struck mute by the blond giant and his unbelievable tale. Pete finally finished his story, released the man, and patted his lapel. He gave him a sly wink and then stood up to his full and imposing height. The shop owner blinked once, and the spell was broken. He looked around at the three of us, standing head and shoulders above him, and said in a small voice, "Well, wherever you gentlemen travel, I think you'll be able to take care of yourselves." As we grabbed our photos and retreated for the door, Pete called over his shoulder, "I'll send you a postcard." Pete's behavior and his story had been so bizarre, I didn't know whether to laugh or curse. But John could barely wait to get outside, and jumped him the minute we hit the parking lot. "Pete, what did you do that for? What was the purpose of that damn story about the magic titty fountain in Amsterdam? What were you hoping to accomplish?" John's face was red with consternation, but he had himself under control, and his voice was calm. "Aw, John," Pete smiled back indulgently. "The guy seemed a little fidgety with all of us standing around the shop and nobody saying much, so I decided to put him at ease with a little small talk. Why, you could see how it took the tension right out of him." Pete nodded his head, as if to acknowledge his own sagacity and amazing social skills. "But don't worry, John. There's no fountain like that in Amsterdam. I made the whole thing up." He slid into the back seat of the car and closed the door. John looked at me across the top of the car and silently shook his head in disbelief. I looked back at him and shrugged my shoulders. From inside the car, Pete called to us, "Come on, guys, let's go." Yep, just a big kid. It took every hour of those 2 days to accomplish our assigned tasks. The methods we used were simple, didn't require elaborate covers, and could be easily imitated by someone with sinister designs, which is why I won't explain how we did it. But the results were impressive. John was able to obtain the roster of the people who worked on the housekeeping staff of the Naval Observatory. He also got their work histories, their addresses, and their home phone numbers. I was able to gain the operations schedule for Andrews Air Force Base, and as a serendipitous bonus, the maintenance schedule for Air Force One for the rest of the year. Pete made quite a haul. He not only got a copy of the weapons roster from the National Guard Armory, but also found out that the bolts for the M16s were stored in the unit safe, that 4 bayonets were missing, and that none of the organization's M60 machine guns would work. Pete had made such a vivid impression on the unit commander that he returned with an autographed picture of the two of them shaking hands and an invitation to the armory for their next weekend drill. I would like to have been a fly on the wall to hear the tale Pete told that commander. That afternoon, we sat down in my motel room to go over everything we had acquired and put all the material into a reportable format. Later, John went out to unload a dead drop while Pete and I worked on a draft of the report. He came back with instructions as to how we would turn over our material and a directive to case 2 more dead drop sites and a location for a personal meeting for the next morning. We decided that I would work on the report while my partners went out to case the sites. Pete asked if there was anything they could bring me when they returned, and I said, "Yeah, bring us a 6-pack of beer and we'll have a couple of cold ones while we go over the finished report." I was still working on the report when they returned. John let himself into the room, closed the door behind him, and leaned against it as if barring further passage. He didn't say anything, but just stood there looking at me. I glanced up from my work and asked, "What's up, John? Where's Pete?" "He'll be along in a minute. He's got his hands full. But I want to ask you a question, Eric, before he comes in." He had a strained look on his face. I put my pen down. "Sure, John. What is it?" "If you were going to buy some beer, where would you go?" There was a muffled knock on the door. John pressed his back against the door and barked, "Wait a minute." He looked back at me with a strange intensity in his eyes. Something was up, but I didn't know what. "Oh, I don't know, John. Where do you usually get beer? A convenience store, a package shop, a grocery store, I guess? Someplace like that?" There was another thud on the door, but John ignored it. "That's right," he said. "Any of those places are where a normal person buys beer, but not our buddy." He turned to throw open the door, revealing Pete standing there, delicately balancing a wobbling cardboard tray that held 6 large plastic cups of beer. "Come on in," John announced as Pete walked through the door, his tongue sticking out from between his lips in concentration, his eyes focused on the tray he was holding at arm's length, trying to keep the beer from dribbling down the front of his shirt. "Come in, Pete, and tell Eric where you buy beer." "At a bowling alley," Pete calmly replied as he set the dripping tray down on a lamp table. "You always get the best tasting beer at a bowling alley. You ought to know that, John." He said it like a patient teacher speaking to a favorite student who was having a little trouble with a subject. John threw up his hands in defeated exasperation. "That's right," he said, turning to address me. "A bowling alley. Not a 7-Eleven, not a grocery store, not a package store. Nothing else would do. It had to be draft beer from a bowling alley. Here, John, have a beer before it gets warm." Pete acted as if he'd never heard the retort and handed a cup to John before passing one to me. "Cheers," he said with a contented smile as we touched the rims of our plastic chalices. "Here's to good friends and a mission well done." The simplicity and heartfelt warmth of that toast took away the rancor that had been building in John's breast for our comrade. I saw it drain from his being as he relaxed, took a sip of beer, and smiled back at Pete. Then he lifted his cup and said, "Yep, cheers, boys." We reviewed the reports as we finished our beer. Once we were satisfied with everything, I made a tight bundle of the papers and went out to load a drop confirming what we'd accomplished. Then we settled in for some sleep. Pete went to the personal meeting at 0400 hours the next morning to turn over our report, while John and I pulled counter-surveillance and overwatched him just in case things got sticky. The meeting went off all right, but Pete was pretty animated when we got back together at our motel. "Guys, we've got to haul ass. We have to be at the train station in Hamlet, North Carolina for a pickup at 4 o'clock this afternoon. And more than that, we can't go by rental car. We're going to have to make our way by some form of public transportation." "Then we take the train," I said, and realized how stupid that was as soon as it came out of my mouth. "No, that won't do, will it? It's too obvious." I tried to think of another way. "We fly," John announced. "But it's a simple matter to watch the airports for anybody going to North Carolina today," said Pete. "We'll be picked up." "We don't take a commercial flight," John countered. "We rent a plane and fly to Hamlet. There's a county airport right outside of town. I flew in there several times when I was taking my private pilot's license after I got back from Vietnam the first time. Then we take the airport courtesy car to the train station. From here it should be about a 3-hour flight. We just find us a small flight operation at an airfield somewhere around here. Tell them we want to rent a plane to fly to North Carolina and that we want one of their pilots to go with us and ferry the plane back. They'll be happy with that, and we'll arrive undetected in Hamlet. And with the 3 of us splitting the cost, it'll also be the cheapest way to go, even paying for the pilot to fly the plane back up here." "That's brilliant, John," I said. "What kind of a plane should we get?" "I think a Cessna 182 would be just about perfect. It can carry 4 people and our luggage. It should be able to make the trip in one jump, and it's relatively fast for a single-engine plane." He picked up the telephone book. "I'll get on the phone and find us one as soon as business hours open. If we can be off the ground by 10 o'clock, we should have plenty of time to make it to Hamlet before 4 o'clock. I looked at my teammate with admiration. "That's perfect, John. A great idea. While you're arranging it, Pete and I will get the cars turned in and get us checked out of here." "Sounds good to me," said Pete. "But first, let's go to breakfast. I'm starving." That, too, was a good idea.
And that was the next part of Preparing the Force from Inside Delta Force from Command Sergeant Major Haney, retired. Back in a minute. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, and reminding you to be honest, smart, and beautiful, and remember that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.